one of the most interesting questions about Bonhoeffer, I'll try to be fairly brisk with this outline or lecture, which will be made available to you all afterwards, right, Bruce?
Yes, definitely.
So I think one of the most interesting questions about Bonhoeffer has to do with why there are so many different contemporary versions of Bonhoeffer. Why it seems like people from across the spectrum can pick and choose the parts of Bonhoeffer that they like, or even invent a Bonhoeffer in their own image. And one way to think about this is this about Bonhoeffer himself? Were there different versions of Bonhoeffer at different stages? And so people say, I'll take the 1933 Bonhoeffer, thank you. I'll take the 1937 Bonhoeffer. No, I'll go with the 1943 Bonhoeffer. Or is it that there are other explanations for why there seem to be so many different versions of Bonhoeffer? So I'm going to describe this as the issue of continuity and discontinuity in Bonhoeffer's writing. Just a word about sources. And that is, if I were the Bonhoeffer expert that I wanted to be, I would have read every word of all 16 volumes of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Fortress Press edition, which I was going to put behind me here on my newly constructed Zoom studio so that I could look as impressive as Dr. Andrea White in her Zoom studio. But anyway, Bonhoeffer is just over to my right here in my office in Atlanta. 16 volumes of Bonhoeffer. And my best known Bonhoeffer is the Bonhoeffer of Life Together, Discipleship, Ethics, and Letters and Papers from Prison. Though, as I say under this caveat and sources, I also assign Testament to Freedom, which includes letters, essays, sermons, speeches, and various other kinds of writings from Bonhoeffer. But there's always more to learn about Bonhoeffer. He only lived to be 39 years old, and yet the various scraps of his writings, essays, and so on fill 16 volumes. So it's about time for some of us to get after it and do some writing, because we're way behind old Dietrich, right? But anyway, so this picture that I'm going to offer is my best composite at this point, knowing that there is always more to learn. So I'm just going to say a word about different stages of Bonhoeffer's journey as I understand it. I'm going to have 10 stages, so I'll be very brisk with each one of these. So you start off with schoolboy Bonhoeffer, from his birth in 1906 through his completion of his doctoral degrees in 1930. Each one of these will have the major events and what he wrote, and I'm just going to have a brief word of interpretation in each case. I mentioned the big move to Berlin when his father got promoted, the loss of his brother Walter, his participation in Germany's overall cultural crisis after World War I and in the early 1920s. His undertaking of his theological work at the University of Berlin, ultimately 2 doctoral dissertations, one that, Sanctorum Communio, and the other Act and Being, the habilitation thesis. Also, he's pursuing a ministry track. So I would say that the Bonhoeffer of the 1920s and before, I describe him as a privileged young man from a great but highly demanding family that was hugely affected by World War I and the loss of his brother. There is some evidence, a little bit, that he flirted with post-war German nationalism. You see it in some speeches and sermons from Spain, but you also see it in the fact, I discovered this earlier this year, that he undertook some paramilitary training in the 1920s with a right-wing paramilitary group. His parents were very worried about this. He didn't continue with that kind of thing, but I think that's very interesting. Meanwhile, he was becoming a very bright young theologian and wrote 2 book-length works in his training. One on a theology of the church and one on a theology of divine or philosophy of divine revelation. He's developing as a minister, though he would say he's not sure he was a Christian during this period, but he's preparing to become a minister, which is interesting. He's also developing some travel experiences that are broadening his perspective. Of course, the travel experience that we're most interested in, probably all of us, is when he comes to New York, second stage of the journey, the 1930-1931 period in New York, where he's taking classes at Union and worshiping and serving at Abyssinian Baptist. It's also interesting to note he took a Christmas time trip to Cuba with one of his fellow students and another one later in the year to Mexico with his French friend Jean Lasserre. What to make of this period of his journey has already been discussed, but I'll summarize it this way, that Bonhoeffer is deeply affected by Black experience for the first time, by Black Christian church life, as well as by the Harlem Renaissance. He suggests a spiritual conversion during this period, which leads to a much deeper focus on Jesus, on the teachings of Jesus, and on actually trying to live them instead of just talking about them. He's appalled by white Christian racism in the U.S. This leaves him better prepared to deal with German Christian anti-Semitic racism when he returns back home to Germany. At Union, he's struck by the heavy role of social ethics and the social gospel and the concern for this world, but he wants deeper systematic theology, and he sure wishes they were reading German theologians more than they were at the time. Reggie and I, Dr. Williams and I talked about kind of his interpretation of this period one more time, and he said that probably something that must be said is that Bonhoeffer went back to Germany, committed to moving far beyond what he called theological phraseology to real-life Christian discipleship. Remember, it was possible to be just a smart theologian and even a churchman without necessarily having much of a personal piety or a personal Christian ethic. It was just a job. In fact, it was a state job. But Bonhoeffer went back with a very different vision, and New York played a big role in that. So, third stage, he's in Berlin, beginning his career as a scholar, pastor, and ecumist. So we'll call this August 1931 to December 1932. His activities are really quite breathtakingly broad. He's teaching at Berlin, University of Berlin. He's getting involved in the European-based ecumenical movement, where he's elected a youth secretary. This is the precursor to the World Council of Churches, by the way. He gets ordained in November of 1931. He's appointed a chaplain to a technical university in Berlin. Apparently that didn't go very well. I didn't enjoy it that much. And he famously takes over a confirmation class of 42 rowdy boys in the poor Berlin neighborhood and ends up being very effective in ministry there. In the summer of 32, he takes part in 3 ecumenical conferences in Europe, and he lectures in Berlin on creation and sin, which becomes the basis for his book published under the English title Creation and Fall. What's most significant about this is he is already challenging orders of creation theology, and we can talk about that later if you want to ask her about that. So my interpretation of Bonhoeffer at this stage is he's changed a lot. He's settled. He has a little apartment in a very poor section of Berlin, so he can be near his young students. He's concerned not just for their spiritual, but also their material condition in a situation of depression, hunger, political instability, and division. He has come back as, by all reports, a very accessible, caring, and student-focused pastor and professor. He's already heavily internationally involved, ecumenically involved. He has become a pacifist, and he's a committed minister. So that's the third stage. But then Hitler comes to power in January of 1933, And Bonhoeffer, like everybody else, has to decide how to respond to this dramatic political change in Germany. He's 27 years old in February of 1933. Still so young. Some notable things during this period, he gives a radio lecture, a pre-scheduled radio lecture on leadership on February 1st, 1933. Hitler had been named Chancellor January 30th, so 2 days before. He writes a document called The Church and the Jewish Question, which is still closely studied. He does some Christology lectures, which later become the book Christ the Center. He gets involved in what's initially called the Young Reformation movement, which is the beginning of the resistance to the Nazification of the German Protestant churches. In June, he organizes a massive student assembly on what is now being called the German church struggle, the struggle for the integrity, theological and organizational integrity of German Protestantism. And then he takes this odd detour. In July, he interviews for and is offered a London pastorate. It's actually two little churches in London. And 3 months later, he goes to London. In between, he's working on a confession of faith in the German church struggle, the Bethel Confession. Part of what may be going on with his taking the London position is he's more radical than most of the older pastors, even on the side of the resistance. He's frustrated with their compromises. He doesn't understand why he sees things differently than they do. He joins the most radical wing, including the founding of the Pastors Emergency League. But there are these awful experiences of watching his fellow German evangelical Protestant Christians Nazifying, including this event called the Brown Synod in Wittenberg, home of the Reformation, where lots and lots of people, including pastors, show up in SA uniforms with swastika armbands and so on. And he's freaked out by watching how German Protestantism is being seduced by Nazism or doesn't even know the difference. I interpret Bonhoeffer during this period as looking for solid ground to resist what he already understands is a quasi-Christian or even neo-pagan idolatry of Hitler and blood and soil, Aryanism, racism, and so on. And I'm pretty confident that throughout his career, at least from this point forward, he believes that only a very, very sturdy theology and practice of Jesus, of following Jesus and understanding Jesus, can help to overcome this idolatry. As a 26, 27-year-old, he's active and leading way beyond his years in the German church struggle. But he's also, as I said, frustrated with it. As for why he goes to London, it's bewildering, but it appears that he was hoping for a temporary escape or a respite, the reconsideration period, and maybe just kind of getting out of the cauldron for a little bit. To me, one of the things that's most notable about this period is his clarity about the threat of Nazism to German Christian integrity, and also his willingness to sacrifice professional security for standing up on grounds of conscience against what is wrong. He's just starting his career. He could easily have compromised like most other people did, but he would not do that. In October of 33, he goes to London and begins his position there. But there is no escape. One of the first things that has to be resolved is whether the German church struggle is going to follow him to England, and it does. He positions his churches with the confessing church and against the Reich Church. In other words, the German Protestant establishment churches are splitting into two groups, at least two, but he positions his churches with the confessing church, so he's still doing church politics there. He's also involving influential British leaders, including Bishop George Bell, to side with the confessing church and against the Reich Church. He's continuing to be involved in ecumenical conferences and gives a famous speech on peace at an ecumenical conference in Denmark, because already by 1934, it's apparent to him that with Hitler in power in Germany, that war might well happen again, a kind of a war of vengeance. In November of 34, he leaves the German churches there to secede entirely from the Reich Church. And then in January of 35, he accepts the call to go back to Germany and direct a confessing church seminary there. Says goodbye in April. So my interpretation is that the issues of the German church struggle followed him to England. Perhaps he could have tried to turn his back on them, but he didn't. In his ecumenical work, he is resisting Nazi nationalism and militarism. He is staying connected to the international church or churches. He's deeply committed to pacifism. And he remains a leading figure in the confessing church. So much of a leading figure that when the confessing church realizes it needs to set up its own separate seminaries, he ends up being named the director of one of these. And this work begins in the spring of 1935 and lasts for basically 2.5 years. And we know about this as the Finkenwalde stage. So a couple things to notice about this period. He walks away from the University of Berlin. He goes to this obscure new startup, first at Zingst and then at Finkenwalde. He's still doing ecumenical work, but by spring of 37, he resigns this work, partly because he's frustrated that they won't take a clear stand against the Nazified German church. They're trying to have it both ways, and he's not happy with that. His resistance is so obvious that by the summer of 37, he is banned formally from teaching in German universities. So he has completely lost his access to official mainstream German academia by this point. And then just a month later, his underground seminary is just shut down by the Gestapo. So what to make of this period? I would say by this period, Bonhoeffer has a strong sense that the only way that, in his view, true Christianity will survive in Germany is by training highly disciplined, deeply Christologically centered, brave, resistant ministers, and by pulling them out of the seductive and idolatrous mainstream German academic environment or church environment and moving them into something more like a Gandhian ashram, where they can be deeply formed by prayer, study, and community, and where they can prepare to resist Nazism, follow Jesus, and prepare to suffer and maybe even die if it should come to that. So that's the 6th stage. By the way, I'm going to speak for no more than 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to throw it open for discussion. The 7th stage, which I call Bonhoeffer in between, is kind of something I had not really thought of as its own stage, but it lasts about 1.5 years. If you think about how desperate the political situation is already getting, by November of 37, 27 of Bonhoeffer's seminarians are already in prison for their resistance to Nazism. Also in November, his book, which we call Discipleship, is published, and it's based on his lectures at the seminary on the Sermon on the Mount and on the teachings of Paul about the nature of the church. still, in many ways, Bonhoeffer's most popular work, but it's published just at the end of the Finkenwalde stage. Also, the seminary work and the pastoral work goes even more deeply underground in what's called the Collective Pastorates, where for a half a year, a group of these Finkenwalde type pastors are doing collective ministry in different communities that are sympathetic to their vision, and also still doing highly underground seminary training. That's called the Collective Pastorates. Interestingly, in February of 38, his brother-in-law, von Dognani, arranged Dietrich's first contacts with the underground resistance leaders situated in the German military intelligence unit, the Abwehr, very high level. So that's interesting. I did not recall that until reviewing for this. And then in September of 38, his sister Sabine emigrated to England with her husband Gerhard Liebholz, who was Jewish, because they saw the handwriting on the wall. And also during that period, in 1 month, he wrote the book Life Together, based on his seminary community experience. So I would describe this as a transitional stage. Discipleship and Life Together are like a pair that are written and published after the experience that they were based on. And in a sense, I think by February of 38, he's already beginning to contemplate a new stage. The stage that moves beyond being a kind of a martyr pastor or resistant pastor to moving, using his family connections to move into a high-level resistance cell. He hasn't decided to do that yet, but he's having his first meeting to think about it. And that is eventually what he ends up doing. Not what you expect of a pastor. And even his fellow pastors didn't understand what he was doing when he was doing it, to the extent that they knew about it. Eighth stage, Bonhoeffer has a one last chance to leave Germany in the spring and summer of 1939. In March, he goes to England, talks with very high-ranking people at this point. He's still just 33 years old. In June, he sails for the U.S., and the original plan was to stay there for 1 year. But in late July, lasting only a month, he goes back to Germany. And interestingly, all this decision-making was done in tandem with his brother, Carl Friedrich, who went to America with him and returned with him. My friend Victoria Barnett, who is the general editor, as I recall, of the Fortress Press series, told me that the brothers received a coded message from their parents asking them to come back home. But also Dietrich himself just never seemed to feel comfortable with the idea of being away from Germany for very long. His sense of loyalty to the seminarians that he had trained, some of whom were now being drafted into the military or were in prison, and his love of his country and the desire to be with his people, whatever happened, was too strong to keep him in America. And so he went back. So he goes back in the summer of 1939. And this stage is also not all that well known, all the details of it, so just a few things about it. So every able-bodied man of military age, broadly understood, was going to have to serve somewhere or basically be shot. And Bonhoeffer did not want to be shot he thought it would be bad for the church for him to just be executed as a pacifist. So he tries to find a place to serve in the military. And he tries to apply for the chaplaincy and is turned down. But amazingly, he's apparently not pressured to get anything resolved all the way until the fall of 1940. So the war begins September 1, 1939. He's still doing collective pastorate work in the fall of 39, but by the spring of 40, the Gestapo closes even that. In March, he meets Oster again. in September, he's banned by the SS from speaking anywhere in Germany. And at the end of October, he is appointed finally to this military intelligence role with the Abwehr. So think about it. You've got the SS and the Gestapo treating you like a criminal, while the military intelligence branch of the army is appointing Bonhoeffer as an intelligence agent, which shows something about his connections. He doesn't have to do anything right at first. He has 3 months where he is at a Benedictine abbey writing on his ethics. But then, beginning in late February of 1941, he has his first trip to Switzerland in the double agent role. And then he has another one in August, September, and is involved in a rescue of Jews in that time. And another trip in April of 42, another one in May, another one in June. All the while working on his ethics book. Highly dangerous double agent type work. In March of 43, there are 2 failed assassination attempts on Hitler, and then in April he's arrested. So what to make of this period? He's a shadowy underground figure. He's writing a secret book that he's going to have no ability to publish in the foreseeable future. He's working in a resistance cell, maybe the major resistance cell in all of Germany. His ethics, my favorite one of his books, I would describe as a concrete, real-world effort to think through Christian ethical obligations in the Nazi dictatorship, knowing that the Nazi regime has now led an aggressive world war that is consuming thousands of lives every day, and by the summer of 41 is doing straight-out genocide on the Eastern Front against Jews. So the what I would describe as theological purism and church against the world and pacifism is gone in ethics. But he's trying to recover something from the history of Christendom, Christian Europe, so-called Christian civilization, something from the ethics of the past and the civilization of the past that he hopes can help to survive and contribute to the moral reconstruction of Germany and what he calls the West. Interestingly, this was also very much on the mind of Pope Pius XII, who was also trying to do diplomacy and to talk about the moral heritage of the Christian West. So I would describe this as the last gasp of Christian Europe, at least in Western Europe. There was no rebuilding of Christian civilization. Finally, the last stage, 5th of April, 1943, he's arrested along with his brother-in-law and another colleague, Mueller, sent to Tegel military prison. So he's in a military prison at first. He's there for a long time. By fall of 43, he's writing these letters with Eberhard Bethke, which are able to be smuggled out. So he's able to speak in an uncensored way. And the theological letters, so-called, begin not till the late spring of 1944, and they became the basis of letters and papers from prison. By May of 44, after a year there, when the case against Dietrich and his brother-in-law is delayed, it appears either he's going to spend decades, in a German prison, kind of like lost in the maze, or he's going to get executed. It's not clear what it's going to look like. But after the Stauffenberg assassination attempt of July fails, and Hitler's on the rampage and is trying to sniff out where the resistance is in the Abwehr, and then especially after September, when incriminating files that I think it's his brother-in-law kept, were discovered, it's pretty clear that there's not going to be any escape. In fact, Dietrich was considering an escape from the prison, but just as he was considering it, his brother and brother-in-law were arrested, so he didn't want to endanger them, so he gave it up. By the spring of 45, Germany, the Nazi regime is doomed, but Hitler is just fighting on and killing even more indiscriminately. So the last part is just endgame, and he's executed on April 9th, 1945. So my last comments. What I think Bonhoeffer is doing in prison is he's reflecting on a very dark period. At one level, any traditional belief in divine sovereignty or the divine orchestration of human events has been shattered. He's also, I think, lost much confidence in the institutional church or even religion, and thinks that they've been discredited. In the conspiracy, he has found community with brave, public-minded people whom he admires for their responsible, illegal, creative action. That's where he's finding community. So it's having him rethink kind of where you find community. It's not necessarily in the church. He's mainly interested at this point in where can you find people who will take a stand, who will be brave, who will risk free action on behalf of others. And who is Jesus? Jesus is the one who suffers, the one pushed to the margins, the one who dies along with those on the bottom of society. He appears to be at peace that despite many twists and turns in the road, he has done his best to follow Jesus faithfully. And now he's getting ready to die. And he dies in that last stage. So my conclusion, I think the entirety of his working life occurred during a period of apocalypse, of national and civilizational crisis. Everything was heightened all the time. I believe that at every stage, at least after his experiences in New York, he was trying to figure out how to follow Jesus, how to be a good pastor, how to theologize about his experiences, how to be a responsible German, how to be a responsible human being. I think the continuity in his writing is provided by that stability of purpose and identity. The discontinuity is explained by the whipsawing effects of the different stages of the Nazi era, which came upon the one after the other so quickly, and how he attempted to navigate each stage, as well as the many things that he was learning and assimilating during each stage. I think that if we read Bonhoeffer in a seriously contextual manner, the differences and different notes that are struck in his writing make sense. Context always matters in reading people's writings, and the contextual changes of his life journey help to explain the twists and turns of his writing. Literally what month it is and what is going on around him matters that much for interpreting his life and work. If we study the context that closely, then the discontinuity issue largely resolves itself.